we're here to talk today about something that I know can feel sometimes confusing and maybe even a little bit stressful, but it doesn't have to be. And that's what we're here to break down today is how to build a smart spending policy for your nonprofit. So, before we dive in, just a quick reminder that this session is educational, not specific investment or legal advice. Every nonprofit situation is different. And if you have detailed questions about your specific situation, we encourage you to talk to your advisor or legal counsel, or feel free to reach out to us after the session and we can talk more about your specific situation. All right. So raise your virtual hand if you've ever sat in a board meeting, looked around the table, and heard a question like, now, how much exactly can we spend out of this endowment? Or maybe you've noticed that the answer to this question tends to change on depending on who's in the room at that time. Or maybe you feel that your organization spends too much of your endowment, or even swings the other way, and that you're not spending enough out of your endowment and utilizing it to the fullest. Or maybe this has happened to you that one time your board made a last minute withdrawal decision that just didn't sit quite right with you, but there were really no instructions stating the otherwise. So these scenarios are all much more common than you think. And so today we are going to unpack all of those. So here's a preview of today of what we're going to cover today. We're going to clarify exactly what is a spending policy, explore the different spending policy models that you can choose from, at least the most common ones, help you understand the impacts of inflation and compliance requirements, and then leave you with some clear next steps on how you can move forward. So our goal is very straightforward today. By the end, you'll feel more confident about managing your spending decisions and knowing exactly how your spending policy can help protect your organization's future. But before we jump into today's content, I wanted to give a quick introduction of who we are. Carnegie Investment Counsel is a registered investment advisory firm. So first and foremost, we're fiduciaries. That means that we are legally and ethically required to put our clients' best interests first, always. And until I started working here, I didn't realize that that is not the case with all advisors. So that would encourage you to ask your advisor that you're working with if they are a fiduciary. We're headquartered here in Cleveland, Ohio, but we work with clients across the country and we also have many offices across the country. And altogether, we manage around $6.5 billion in assets for individuals, institutions, and of course, nonprofits like you. And speaking of the nonprofit sector, that's really where Carnegie is unique because we have built a dedicated nonprofit team that focuses on supporting mission-driven organizations, not just with investment management, but with bigger picture strategy, fundraising, education, and tools, just like this webinar. So we want to help you make smart, confident decisions that support your mission really for the long run, not just today. So who are we going to be hearing from today? Well, I am your host, Megan Linkoski. I'm Carnegie's nonprofit development specialist. I've been working in nonprofits for the last 12 years, primarily in fundraising and development, really helping organizations grow their revenue, diversify their funds, and make a bigger impact. We also have Mindy Mackey on the call, who's Carnegie's marketing manager. Along with overseeing the in and outbound marketing strategies for the firm, she also serves as the liaison for nonprofits seeking to partner with an investment advisor. Mindy is my admin team on the back end and will be monitoring the chat and Q&A and maybe responding to you. So if you see that's who she is. Then we have our thought leader today, Chris Carey, Vice President and Portfolio Manager here at Carnegie. He specializes in portfolios for individuals and nonprofit organizations. With a deep understanding of financial markets and the nonprofit sector, he provides strategic guidance to help organizations achieve their long term financial goals. All right. So, one last slide before we dive in. Firstly, yes, this session is being recorded and we'll send the replay out to everyone afterwards. So, if you missed anything or want to share it with a colleague or a board member, you'll have that chance. We'll also have Q&A time at the end, but please don't wait until the end to insert your questions because if you're like me, you will forget them. So put them in as we're going through everything today. Feel free to drop your questions in there is a Q&A section. There's also the chat bot or the chat section. We'll be monitoring both of those, but please go ahead and submit your questions as we're going through them. If it's anything super timely, we'll stop and address it, or we'll address them all at the end. And lastly, we've pulled together a few free resources to help you get started. That's including a spending policy template. So we'll share that template and the other resources like blog posts. We have an on-demand recording that we want to share and any links that you can start using right away. So we'll share that at the end and in the follow-up email. All right, it is time to hand it over to Chris Carey. So Chris, will you start us off with just the basics? What actually is a spending policy?
Thanks, Megan. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. It's wonderful to see so many people in attendance and even some investment advisors. So for those people, I hope that we can impart some good knowledge then that you can even pass on to your own clients. So to kick things off, what exactly is a spending policy? Simply put, a spending policy is a clearly written set of guidelines that helps you establish how much you can spend from your endowment each year. And during this webinar, you're going to hear me say the word endowment, but the same principles are relevant to other form of accounts, such as a long-term board-directed investment account. To delineate between those two, I will quickly define them for you. An endowment is typically referred to as a pool of funds, typically but not always set to last in perpetuity, providing you with income each and every year. Sometimes these may be donor restricted or established by the organization, but each year, quarter, month, etc., you'll be making withdrawals towards its specified purpose. And once established, it's harder to modify, especially if those funds were provided by a donor for a specific purpose, which we typically would call donor restricted funds. A long-term board-directed investment account, however, can be adjusted more easily based on your needs. Typically, an organization will invest surplus funds for growth, but they may want to maintain that flexibility down the line. And there, a spending policy can be used as a guide, but they're structuring this account in such a way that they have complete access to their funds if need be. And later on, I'll mention why it's pivotal that you refer to your funds in the correct manner. So I'll be speaking about endowments here, but just keep in the back of your mind that this content is still very relevant to other forms of long-term investing accounts. And so now, practically speaking, where does this spending policy live? Almost always, it's a section within your investment policy statement. But in some cases, it's a separate document that the investment policy statement references. Ultimately, it needs to be easily accessible, reviewed regularly, and understood by your board and leadership. And here's why that matters. Your endowment isn't a checking account. Without clear rules, it's very easy to drift into spending based on short-term thinking, market fluctuations, or even the loudest voice in the boardroom. A spending policy gives you confidence, consistency, and clarity. It lets you balance today's needs with tomorrow's stability. So let's dive into the various methodologies for calculating how much should be spent. These are ranked the most common to least common, in my opinion. Nonprofits set their spending policy. The first is what we call a moving average. Instead of saying each year we're just going to pull 5% out of whatever the year-end market value was, we're going to use a smoothing mechanism where we will calculate the average market value over a specified period of time. It might be the average of the last 12 quarters or so. And then that is what's used to calculate the amount spent. This allows you to smooth out some of that volatility when there are big up years or big down years. And that's typically the most common methodology we see. Then we have fixed percentage, which you might have gathered I've kind of already partially defined. This allows you to pull a defined percentage of the market value out of the account every year. It's very straightforward to calculate. But if you're dependent on these funds as part of your budget, and the date you set to value those funds for this calculation happens to be in the midst of a sharp market correction, you'll feel that impact a lot more. Just look back this year, where the market from Jan 1st to today, the overall US stock market was up around 3 or 4%. But during that time, we've also experienced around a 15% drawdown during that period. That's pretty typical in a given year to see that sort of intra-year volatility. So this is a very easy way to calculate, what you should take for your spending policy, but you open yourself up to a fair bit more volatility. Then there's the floor cap approach, also known as a guardrail mechanism. Some people call it a corridor approach. But this approach typically builds on top of another method, like a moving average that I explained first of all, and it adds a floor and a cap to the effective spending rate. That means that when you calculate your spending amount, say that 5% of the trailing last 12 quarters, you then check that that amount doesn't actually fall below the minimum, say 4%, or above the maximum, say 6%, or whatever that current market value is. If it does, you adjust accordingly. And the guardrail system helps you from overdrawing the fund in very, very sharp downturns, or underlining it during periods of strong growth. It adds a layer of discipline and helps stabilize distributions, though it does add complexity and it may be harder to explain to stakeholders who expect a single clear formula. And then finally here I have fixed dollar, which is typically inflation adjusted, and it means that rather than calculating a percentage of the portfolio's value every year, the organization simply withdraws a fixed dollar amount annually, often with an inflation adjustment built in. So say, for example, you might say, we're going to be spending $50,000 each year from this fund and increasing that by 2% annually to account for inflation. Or you might actually want to use the real CPI inflation figures that are provided to build that into your calculation. This provides total predictability for budgeting purposes, but the trade-off is that it doesn't respond to market performance whatsoever. So in strong years, you may be leaving money on the table, and in down years, you could be drawing a much larger percentage of the fund than you realize, which could jeopardize the long-term sustainability if it's not carefully monitored. And for that reason, it's more typical to see in project-based funding or term endowment, where if there's any money left over, it typically then gets swept into another fund for a separate purpose, versus being used for something that's more in perpetuity. So, how to choose the right spending model? The truth is, there is no one size fits all here, and your model needs to match your goals, your specific goals for this account, as well as your organization's tolerance for risk and your governance style. So ask yourself, how predictable do distributions need to be? How much market volatility are we willing to absorb? Do we have the capacity for hands-on governance? What are our long-term return assumptions? And how often are we even going to revisit our financial strategy? And for larger organizations, they have teams of staff that are able to work through these questions. But for small but mighty teams, as my colleague Megan likes to say, this is where it's very useful to retain outside advice, typically from an investment advisor. Let's just talk briefly about one critical mistake that we often see, which is setting a spending rate that's too high. It sounds great initially, more money to support programs today, but it significantly increases the risk that you're going to erode your endowment's long-term value, which will harm your organization's sustainability. And that's what the endowment typically was set up in the first place, to bolster that sustainability. Here's a great chart that speaks to the risks of a high spending rate. On the top, you have your allocation to stock versus bonds within a portfolio, and each row shows you that withdrawal rate over a period of 30 years. The heat map you see is the probability of success over the 30-year period from 1926 to 2022. As you can see, as you dial up your withdrawal rate, you increase the risk of depleting your account. So, practically speaking, what should actually be included in your spending policy. On the screen, you'll see a list of key sections and elements to include for a complete spending policy. These will also be outlined in the spending policy template that we're going to share with you all later. And here's a good framework to get started. First, clearly define your spending rate, your calculation method, and the date you're actually using to make that valuation. You want to set the frequency of policy reviews, typically this is annually, and clarify who's responsible for reviews and adjustments. Typically, that's going to be your board and your finance committee, usually in conjunction with your investment advisor. And then also include how exceptional circumstances or emergencies will be handled. So, what about UPMIFA? It's typically known in long form as the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. And I say typically because UPMIFA is a legal framework that has been adopted into law by almost every state. But in some states, like New York, it goes by a different name, NIPMIFA, the New York Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act. And it actually has more requirements in there than those of other states. The law overall guides nonprofits on how to responsibly manage and spend from endowments. We have a great resource on UPMIFA that I will have Megan include in the follow-up resources. And you can find what states have adopted UPMIFA at uniformlaws.org. And in simple terms, it means you need to act prudently with an eye towards both current and future needs. Your spending policy helps you clearly demonstrate that you're meeting that legal standard. And if you stray from spending prudently, it opens up the organization and its directors to legal action, either from donors or from your state attorney general's office. Your board's role is also critical here. They don't need to be financial experts, but they do need to understand and regularly review your spending policy. It's about governance and accountability, ensuring your policy aligns with your organization's mission and strategy. So, let's talk about a few common mistakes we see nonprofits make when it comes to spending policies and how you can avoid them. First up, believe it or not, is not having a written policy at all. It might live in someone's head, or it might be talked about once in a board meeting 3 years ago, but if it's not written down, it's very hard to follow, let alone revisit or improve. The second I'd call reactive withdrawals, and this is when decisions are getting made based on a budget shortfall or a market panic instead of having a long-term strategy that helps keep you on the tracks. A clear policy helps you avoid those in-the-moment scrambles. And then finally, no connection to your IPS. Your investment policy statement is really the cornerstone of how this account is going to be managed, how the assets are, what's the asset allocation. But your spending policy explains how you actually use those assets. So you need those two parts to be aligned. Otherwise, you might find that your IPS and your asset allocation isn't fit for purpose and you can run into real trouble. So what's next? The good news is that if you don't have to overhaul everything overnight, and whether you're starting from scratch or revisiting a policy that, let's face it, probably hasn't been touched for years, there's a simple path forward. Let's start the conversation. If you don't have a spending policy yet, bring it up at your next board meeting or finance committee meeting. You don't have to have all the answers, but just getting the conversation started is important. Then gathering the right people who understand the organization's finances, investments, and long-term goals. That's typically going to be your finance team, an investment advisor if you have one, leadership, and appropriate board members. If you have a policy, that's great. It's now time to dust that off and read it with some fresh eyes. Is it still relevant? Is it still clear? Is it still fit for purpose? And are we actually abiding by it or using it? And then clarifying goals. What are you actually trying to accomplish with this endowment or reserve fund? Is it sustainability? Is it program growth? Is it stability during lean years? Your goals will shape how your spending policy is built. And then you have to select a spending model. So that's choosing one that matches your organization's risk tolerance, funding needs, and investment strategy. And then documenting it properly. And that means writing it down, keeping it simple and practical, but making sure it's something that everybody on your board understands and that your staff and investment advisor can follow. If you're using our template, this step just became a whole lot easier for you. And then educating and approving it. Walking through your board or leadership through the policy, give space for questions, get buy-in, and then have it adopted formally so everyone can be on the same page going forward. And once you've done that, it's important to set regular reviews. This is something that I see time and time again. People push off the agenda during a finance committee meeting because there are more pressing issues to get to. But set it in your calendar. Make sure that you are reviewing it every 12 to 18 months. And again, this typically lives within your investment policy statement. So that's a great opportunity to not overhaul, but review everything at once. To make things easier, we've created a nonprofit spending policy template that you can use as a starting point, and it includes the core elements most commonly found in a spending policy and is designed to help you get the conversation started with your team. And of course, you're going to want to tailor it to your organization's goals, structure, and governance processes. And we always recommend reviewing it with your investment advisor and legal counsel before finalizing anything. But if you've been staring at a blank page, this will help you move forward with some clarity and confidence. Okay, so that was a lot, but hopefully it's a bit clearer now. Remember, clarity and practicality are your friends here. So I'm going to pass things back over to Megan to wrap things up and take any questions that you might have submitted. And if you haven't, now's a great time. So Megan, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. That was fantastic. While you were talking, you've mentioned a few things that made me think of resources I want to send over. You mentioned investment policy statement. And for those who are thinking, oh, shoot, what is an investment policy statement? Or again, we have one, but it hasn't been looked at in 10 years. We have an on-demand webinar that I'll include in the follow-up email that is how to craft an investment policy statement for your nonprofit. And so I'll include that webinar. We also have a great resource on UpMIFA if you have more questions about that. I did want to clarify one thing about UpMIFA, and Chris, please correct me if I'm wrong, but UpMIFA is governing organizations that have a true endowment, which most often is a donor designated endowment, this endowment that is meant to live into perpetuity. Something like a board designated investment fund that has some different requirements is not always legally bound by UpMIFA. And it can be a little tricky. That's why it is recommended that you do talk with your legal counsel or investment advisor that to talk specifically about your organization and in your state where you're incorporated and to talk about your specific organization.
Yeah, exactly. I was talking with a client based out of New York yesterday where we were talking about DIPMIFA, and that's exactly the case. They happen to have an endowment versus a board designated investment account. And so there are many parts and principles of DIPMIFA that are applicable to all forms of accounts. But for endowments, there are specific things that are required. So, and New York, for instance, they have a specific percentage, 7%, which is considered prudent. So when you spend above that, there's a lot of documentation requirements if you did want to essentially go above that level. So every state is different. So work with somebody, legal or investment advisor, who's able to understand that, has experience there, and can advise you accordingly.
Great. Thanks for helping me clarify that, Chris. I know UpMIFA can feel a little overwhelming also, so I will send over our blog post that we have about UpMIFA that can help start answering some of those questions. Peggy, I see you asked if you could get a copy of the presentation, and yes, we will send the copy of the deck over. So, and that'll be in the follow-up email as well. All right. So thank you again, Chris, for all of that helpful information. We appreciate everyone being here. And I did want to go into a couple questions. So, Chris, if you had to pick just one biggest mistake that you see nonprofits make with their spending policies, what would that be?
Typically, I would say that it's having a spending rate that is not fit for purpose. That is too high. Um, and typically it's not something that they might have set out to be following, say, a 5 or a 6% spending rate, but they haven't actually been tracking it. And when you're doing the math and you're looking through the withdrawals, that number is sometimes 8, 9, 10% in given years. So when you have withdrawal rates that high, you're opening yourself up to what we call sequence of returns risk, where you might be eroding your account faster than the market appreciation is, pushing in the opposite direction to help keep you afloat. So that's kind of it, really, is having a spending rate that's too high, not adhering to it, or not adhering to it, and not really having the proper processes in place to make sure that we are doing what we set out, initially, and making sure that that's being followed properly.
And that's also why having it written down is also so important.
For sure.
Being able to go back and refer to something. And then also with overturn of employees, of board members, having that written policy that you can refer to, educate new people as they come on. That's very, really helpful. So, Chris, you mentioned inflation briefly. Could you explain again why that's something that we need to explicitly account for in our spending policy?
Yeah, sure thing. So, as people, you and I, when or organizations, when you're spending money on goods or services, vast majority of those things are going to be affected by inflation, which means that the over time, the cost of those goods are going to go up. And so if your spending policy is not taking into account the fact that whatever your budget line item that this endowment might be covering today, you have to forecast your costs well into the future. What do we expect these to increase, based on past history or, this sector of goods? What's inflation typically like for, this section of goods? I always, like to say people think that inflation is like 2 or 3% a year, but then you take something like college funding, again, separate from nonprofits, but college funding and how much that tuition costs are for that, it's multiples higher than your typical inflation rate. So working with someone that understands all that, and then making sure that that's built into your spending policy to make sure that you are able, your account is able to outpace inflation and still meet its specified goal or whatever it is it's trying to fund, is something that's very, very important to keep in mind. And typically, the only way that you're going to be able to outpace inflation is by having money invested in equities.
Yeah, great. All right, we're going to end with this one last question, reminder. And if we have organizations on the call today that have realized that they have a policy that is outdated and they need to revisit it, what's the one first thing that they should go do tomorrow?
Um, I would say, dust off your investment policy statement, get together with the board, and review it. And if you have an investment advisor, do that too. A lot of investment policy statements say that you should review it every 12 to 18 months. Sometimes that responsibility is delegated to the investment advisor, sometimes that board responsibility is delegated to the board. Typically, it's never actually the case. And, we do live in turbulent markets. A lot of nonprofits have, federal funding, of which some worry that that might be cut. That's kind of the topic du jour at the moment. And so, is our investment policy statement and and why we're investing, is everything fit for purpose? Is our asset allocation fit for purpose right now? Having a complete overhaul really is the not overhaul, but like a complete deep dive and review is something that I would encourage everybody to do.
Great. Thank you. And I encourage you organizations to not be shy about reaching out to your investment advisor to have these conversations because that's why they're there to help you through this. And if they aren't able to assist you, please reach out. And again, even if you have more specific questions about your organization, please reach out to us and we can review those with more specific information for you. All right. Well, we are at time. So I just want to thank everyone again so much for coming and joining us. And we hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye bye.